Welcome to the deep dive. Before we even get started today, I want to look right at you, the listener, and ask you to do us a massive favor.
Yeah, please do.
Take a second right now, if you would, to like this audio track or video and subscribe to the show. It tells the algorithms that you want more custom-tailored, really in-depth breakdowns just like this one.
It really is the lifeblood of what we do. I mean, it allows us to keep bringing you these highly detailed explorations week after week.
Absolutely. Now, on to the main event. Today's deep dive is an exclusive, very extensive review of a highly provocative new ebook published in 2025. It's called Strength Over Silence: Why Men Must Lead, Not Plead by Conrad Riker.
And this one is, wow, it's intense.
It is, and let me hook you right out of the gate here. If you are someone who wants to deeply understand the history of our institutions, the mechanics of the modern culture wars, and specifically the arguments about how society functioned before institutions were allegedly captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, you absolutely need to check out this book.
For sure. You can go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy it. And you should definitely follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, add Conrad Riker.
Yeah.
But because of the highly polarizing nature of this text, before we go any further, I need to make a mandatory impartiality disclaimer.
Right. This is crucial.
The source material we're looking at today contains highly politically charged content. It is written specifically for a men's rights and red-pilled manosphere audience. I want to clearly declare that neither of us here is taking a side, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints presented in the book.
Exactly. Our mission today is entirely objective. We aren't here to validate or to debunk.
Right. Our mission in this deep dive is to impartially report on the ideas, decode the underlying arguments, and help you understand the specific worldview presented in the text regarding the history of modern institutions, biology, and culture. We just want to lay out Riker's architecture so you can examine the blueprints for yourself.
And those blueprints are, well, he explicitly calls this book a war manual.
A war manual, yeah.
The foundational premise that sets the stage for everything else is this idea that modern culture has waged a multi-front war on masculinity. According to Riker, society now demands vulnerability, endless consensus, and, emotional openness from men.
But he argues that human biology and the entire history of human civilization actually demand the exact opposite.
Right. Stoicism, physical strength, decisive leadership, unilateral leadership.
And he doesn't just throw that out as some philosophical grievance. He builds this argument using a really specific mix of evolutionary biology, historical anecdotes. We're talking everything from the Roman Empire to the Spartans and modern statistical data.
He synthesizes all of that to argue that civilization is currently in a state of free fall precisely because men have abandoned their natural biological posts.
He paints a picture of a society trying to run on an operating system that fundamentally clashes with its own hardware.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with what Riker calls the biological baseline and the myth of the modern man. The book paints a very stark, very bleak picture of modern physical decline.
It's pretty alarming data.
Yeah, he points to this incredible statistic right in the first chapter. A 30-year-old man today allegedly has 20% lower testosterone than a man of the exact same age during the Reagan era.
20%.
Right. And Riker uses this to argue that the modern office cubicle is essentially a cage, and that our modern obsession with comfort is literally killing men from the inside out.
And he traces that decline directly to the environment we've built. Modernity, in Riker's view, has engineered a habitat that is actively hostile to male endocrinology. He brings in a Harvard study that tracked 5,000 men over a decade.
What did they find?
The findings were that men who work as desk jockeys, those in comfortable climate-controlled offices sitting in ergonomic chairs, have 15% lower testosterone than men working as manual laborers like mechanics or welders.
So the argument is that a lack of physical friction literally signals the body to shut down its masculine drive.
Precisely. The text argues that the male genome hasn't updated for the digital age. It still expects the physical stress of survival, lifting heavy objects, exposure to the elements.
So when a guy's primary physical exertion is just moving digital columns on a spreadsheet.
His biology assumes he is obsolete, and it downregulates hormone production accordingly.
Wow. Riker gives a fascinating anecdote to bring this down to earth. He talks about a 35-year-old client of his who is experiencing this exact kind of physical and mental atrophy. Lethargic, depressed, losing his edge.
The typical modern malaise.
Exactly. But instead of putting him on medication, the guy completely upended his life. He quit his high-paying guest job, started hauling lumber by day, and completely overhauled his diet. Swapped out a modern diet heavy in soy for one heavily focused on steak.
And the results?
According to the book, within 6 months, this client's testosterone levels doubled. Doubled. His own doctor actually accused him of taking synthetic steroids.
That's insane.
But it was just the result of, as Riker puts it, stopping living like a lab rat.
It's a powerful individual example, but Riker extrapolates this biological atrophy to a macro societal level. He points to Japan as the ultimate, terrifying cautionary tale of where this leads. Have you heard of the herbivore epidemic in Tokyo?
I've seen headlines, yeah, but how does Riker frame it?
He frames it as a demographic collapse driven by biological retreat. The herbivore men are a growing demographic of young Japanese men who are completely abandoning traditional masculine roles.
Meaning what, exactly?
They aren't pursuing dating, they aren't chasing career ambition, they aren't interested in fatherhood. Instead, they are escaping entirely into virtual lives. Riker notes that hundreds of thousands of these men are deeply engaging with anime characters, even purchasing these elaborate waifu virtual reality honeymoon packages rather than pursuing real relationships with women.
Which connects directly to Japan's massive fertility crash.
Yeah.
We're down to 1.3 children per woman. It's a demographic death spiral.
And Riker asserts this isn't just a cultural quirk of the tech age. He calls it biological treason, but he doesn't entirely blame the men.
He blames the culture.
Right. He argues this is the mathematical outcome of a culture that simultaneously mocks masculinity while depending on it for its infrastructural survival. According to his worldview, feminist workforce policies and cultural shifts push men out of their traditional roles as undisputed leaders and sole providers.
So, feeling biologically redundant and socially penalized, these men just went on strike.
Exactly. They retreated into virtual harems where they couldn't be criticized.
And what's wild is what happens when men actually do try to play along with modern rules. Riker cites a 2021 study from the Journal of Endocrinology that honestly blew my mind.
The moderate man experiment.
Yes, men underwent 6 months of intense communication training. They were explicitly taught to use I feel statements, practice active listening, and become more emotionally available and conflict avoidant in their relationships.
And what were the physiological results of that behavioral shift?
That's the kicker. Those men saw a 17% drop in their testosterone levels over the course of the study.
A literal biological downgrade in real time.
Exactly. A measurable chemical shift. Riker uses this to argue that middle ground, consensus-seeking masculinity isn't just socially awkward, it is biologically destructive. He claims that appeasing others, pleading for understanding, and suppressing natural dominance chemically alters a man. It's as if the body punishes the man for suppressing his evolutionary hardwiring.
So if this biological baseline is real, how does it collide with modern social expectations? This brings us to a massive paradox in the text. Riker argues that men today are trapped in a vicious double bind when it comes to dating and corporate culture.
The Goldilocks effect.
Right. Society, HR departments, and women publicly demand emotional availability. The stated preference is always for a sensitive, vulnerable, communicative partner. But biologically, Riker argues, the hidden, revealed preference actually rewards traditional dominance.
I want you, the listener, to really picture this because it's a trap so many people find themselves in. Riker points to internal data from the dating app Hinge. This isn't survey data where people say what they think they should say. This is behavioral data.
People voting with their thumbs.
Exactly. The data showed that women swiped right 7 times more often on profiles, where men listed their occupation as CEO or entrepreneur, compared to men who overtly advertised themselves as a feminist ally or emotionally available.
It's a profound cognitive dissonance. People's stated desires don't match their biological sorting mechanisms.
And he backs it up with Pew Research showing that 73% of men feel trapped by this exact dynamic. They're constantly criticized for being too stoic. They're told they need to open up, go to therapy, share their feelings.
But the second they actually do,
The second they show real vulnerability or fear, they are penalized by their partners. The attraction drops because, according to Riker, their partners biologically want a rock, not a patient.
this raises a huge question in Riker's worldview. What happens when our massive legal and social institutions are built around the publicly stated desire for egalitarianism while completely ignoring these harsh biological realities?
They become weaponized.
Exactly. Riker argues that institutions, particularly the family court system, have been entirely captured by feminist ideology. He views these courts not as places of justice, but as battlegrounds where men are systematically targeted and disadvantaged.
He goes hard on this. He points specifically to something called the primary caregiver doctrine. Riker notes that before the 1960s, fathers won 60% of contested custody cases. 60%. Today, that number has plummeted to just 18%.
A massive drop.
The book frames this massive shift as a tactical ambush on fatherhood. He argues that courts essentially weaponize a mother's early biological bonding time with an infant against the father's historical biological role as a provider outside the home.
To illustrate how a man is supposed to navigate this captured system, Riker shares an incredibly tense story about a Detroit mechanic going through a vicious custody battle. According to the text, his ex-wife was actively coaching their young daughter to act terrified of him during supervised visits. She was trying to fabricate abuse claims to strip him of all parental rights.
So how did the mechanic fight back? Because Riker is all about action.
He used what Riker calls warrior documentation. The mechanic realized he couldn't just plead his innocence to a system he believed was rigged against him. So he hid a tiny, high-definition camera inside a teddy bear.
Wow.
That camera ended up capturing undeniable footage of the mother literally bribing the child with ice cream to make these false allegations of abuse. He played the tape in court, completely bypassed the hearsay, won full custody, and exposed the manipulation.
That is intense.
Riker uses this as a core lesson for his readers. He says, treat every interaction like a Senate hearing. You have to assume the institutional system is biased against you from the jump, and you must lead through relentless, unemotional, documented presence.
And Riker scales this argument up from the individual family court to an entire national level. He looks at Sweden's gender-neutral experiment as his ultimate cautionary tale. Sweden, famously, tried to mandate absolute equality across its society, doing things like dismantling all male teams in factories to enforce mixed gender quotas, and pushing heavily for gender-neutral parenting laws.
And according to the data Riker presents in the book, it was an absolute disaster. He claims there was a 30% productivity drop in these newly mixed gender factory teams.
Because the dynamics got weird.
Precisely. Because the men constantly second-guessed their own instructions and actions to avoid seeming toxic or overbearing. Meanwhile, the women were pushed into grueling physical tasks their bodies weren't optimized for. Riker notes that emergency room visits for the female workers tripled.
He also highlights this crazy story of Lars Anderson, a Swedish father who allegedly lost custody of his son. And why did he lose custody? Simply for teaching the boy how to build a fire in the woods.
You're kidding.
No, the state apparently deemed this act too stereotypically masculine, and a violation of the state's gender-neutral parenting ethos.
Furthermore, Riker points to the Swedish military, which, in the pursuit of equity, lowered its physical fitness standards to accommodate female recruits. The result, he claims, was a 40% spike in female injuries during training.
And men.
Simultaneously, the male recruits ended up detraining down to civilian levels because the friction and competition were removed. For Riker, Sweden is the undeniable empirical proof that when a society ignores biological reality in favor of ideological utopianism, systemic collapse isn't just possible, it is the only possible outcome.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Riker transitions from this broad cultural critique into the literal microscopic architecture of the male brain. In Section 3, he talks about the architecture of authority and how decisions are actually made.
This part is fascinating.
He asserts that male brains have 15% thicker myelin sheaths in a very specific area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Let's translate that for the listener because it's crucial. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is essentially the brain's command center for complex problem solving, risk assessment, and rapid decision making.
Right.
Think of a myelin sheath like the rubber insulation around a copper electrical wire. If the insulation is thicker, the electricity, or in this case a neurological brain signal, travels significantly faster without leaking or degrading. Riker is arguing that because male brains have 15% thicker insulation in this specific decision-making area, they are literally physically hardwired to make rapid unilateral gut decisions.
Which means consensus-driven groupthink, or sitting in a circle sharing feelings about a decision, is biologically unnatural and agonizing for them.
Exactly. The hardware is designed for an immediate executive override, not a democratic poll.
And he contrasts this biological mandate with the danger of democracy, especially when a crisis hits. He looks at corporate history to prove this. We all know what happened to Blockbuster. Riker points out that Blockbuster spent 90 agonizing days in committee meetings debating democratically over whether to buy Netflix or pivot their business model to streaming.
Paralysis by consensus.
They were completely paralyzed. Meanwhile, Reed Hastings at Netflix made a unilateral dictatorial pivot in just 7 days. He didn't ask for a vote, he just acted.
He uses military history to back this up as well, which is incredibly grim, but effective for his point. He cites the sinking of the USS Indianapolis during World War II. According to the text, as the survivors floated in the shark-infested ocean for days, large groups of them debated democratically whether it was safe to drink the seawater.
Oh man.
Riker claims this democratic paralysis, this need for group validation, killed hundreds as they hallucinated and died. But the 12 men who survived the longest, they were the ones who simply ignored the committee vote, made a unilateral decision, and acted on their own survival instincts.
To combat this modern hesitation, this fear of acting without permission, Riker teaches his readers a practical tool he calls the Musk countdown. If you are listening to this and you find yourself paralyzed by a decision, whether it's sending an email, confronting a boss, making a financial move, you literally say out loud, 3, 2, 1, act.
Just forcing the issue.
The book claims this verbal cue forcefully bypasses the prefrontal hesitation loops, short circuits the need for consensus, and forces immediate execution. It's all about action over words.
Which ties perfectly into his next concept, silent dominance. Riker deeply explores what he calls the arithmetic of speech. He cites a Harvard Business Review study claiming that men who speak less than 30% of the time in corporate meetings are perceived by their peers and superiors as 35% more competent.
Because words are the currency of the uncertain. He argues that if you are constantly over-explaining yourself, pleading your case, or filling dead air, you look weak.
Right. He points to General James Chaos Mattis, who famously would just stare down subordinates in complete unbroken silence before giving a single terse order, or Calvin Coolidge, whose presidential resignation letter was famously just 9 words long.
And it's not just how much you speak, but the literal physical frequency of your voice. This is where Riker gets incredibly granular. He references MIT Media Lab data showing that lowering your vocal pitch by 35 hertz makes a man seem 60% more authoritative to listeners.
But how does he suggest a guy actually do that? Because I'm just imagining a guy sitting in his room trying to force a fake deep voice.
He actually prescribes a physical protocol for it called the hum-bass method. He instructs readers to spend 2 minutes a day humming at exactly 60 hertz. The claim is that this consistent vibration biologically thickens the vocal cords over time, permanently dropping the vocal baseline.
It sounds a bit absurd on the surface, but it fits perfectly into his obsession with physical control. And he connects this highly controlled, contained sense of self to physical boundaries as well. The expert guide to building an empire, according to Riker, doesn't start in a sprawling open-plan office. It starts in a space under 300 square feet. He calls it the war room.
He draws an evolutionary line here that is quite compelling. Our prehistoric ancestors survived in highly contained, easily defensible spaces like caves, which forced hyperfocus and minimized external sensory distraction.
Riker points out that Henry Ford designed a literal chairless workshop. If you wanted to be in there, you had to be standing and working, forcing action. SpaceX was born in a cramped semi-trailer. The Vikings built longhouses that rigidly, physically separated workspaces from living and lounging spaces.
Riker asserts that men desperately need these spatial constraints. He calls them the 3 gates of psychological boundaries. He argues you cannot build an empire in a borderless, open-plan house where your laptop is on the kitchen island and the TV is in the background. You need a constrained space dedicated solely to execution.
And this idea of friction, constraint, and enclosed spaces leads us right into Section 4, War Games, Brotherhood, and the Violence Vaccine. Riker makes the fundamental case that civilization doesn't just tolerate friction, it actually requires it to survive and innovate.
If you hate conflict, Riker's next point is going to be a tough pill to swallow. He looks at the Yanomami tribe in the Amazon, who highly ritualize physical conflict, and he compares their brain development to modern Max Planck Institute studies on grandmaster chess players.
The book claims that simulated warfare, whether it's physical combat in a tribe or moving pieces on a chessboard, literally thickens the brain's planning and strategic regions. Without that conflict, those regions atrophy.
What's fascinating here is how he distinguishes between modern, casual friendships and historical, functional brotherhoods. He argues that modern men settle for what he dismissively calls book clubs.
Book clubs.
Yeah, buddy groups that meet at a brewery just to complain about their wives, their bosses, share their feelings. A true brotherhood, in Riker's definition, isn't about emotional validation. It is built on shared standards, a common enemy or goal, and ruthless accountability.
He uses the PayPal mafia as the ultimate modern example of this. We're talking about Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman. These guys didn't build a multi-billion-dollar empire through emotional vulnerability and trust falls. They built it through intense, standard-driven, high-friction collaboration.
He links this back to the Roman testudo formation, the tortoise formation where soldiers interlock their shields. If one man dropped his shield, the whole unit died. Riker outlines 5 mandatory traits of elite male networks: secrecy, selective recruitment, ritual traditions, a strict meritocracy where feelings don't matter, and a relentless focus on building a multi-generational legacy.
And to maintain that kind of high-stakes brotherhood, it requires a fundamental reassessment of aggression. This raises an important question for you, the listener. Is aggression inherently bad? Modern society overwhelmingly says yes. But Riker's worldview says absolutely not. He introduces a concept called the violence vaccine.
Wait, so Riker is saying that the cure for male aggression isn't therapy or calming down, but actually more violence, just highly controlled violence. Walk me through that, because it sounds completely counterintuitive.
The book argues that untamed, unguided, spontaneous aggression is highly dangerous and destructive. But controlled, ritualized aggression is actually deeply healing and biologically necessary for men. It acts as an exhaust valve.
Okay.
He cites a Mayo Clinic study showing that men who regularly engage in martial arts sparring see their baseline, walking around aggression biomarkers, slashed by 40%.
Because they've spent that energy in a structured environment.
Exactly. He points to prison programs that introduced brutal combat sports like judo or bare-knuckle boxing into the yards. Instead of increasing violence, these programs resulted in massive, statistically significant drops in overall yard recidivism and random disciplinary issues.
Riker sharply contrasts this biological approach with modern society's tendency to medicalize male energy. He is highly critical of the overprescription of SSRI antidepressants to men and boys, which, according to the text, chemically lower testosterone, blunt ambition, and artificially sedate natural male drives instead of harnessing them.
He frames this all within a broader risk calculus, and the story he uses here is wild. He shares the story of a high-level Wall Street trader who was completely losing his edge. He was getting fearful, making bad trades, suffering from anxiety.
His firm wanted to send him to an executive therapist, right?
Yeah, but instead the trader started skydiving every single weekend. Riker calls this the mammoth effect. By facing legitimate moral danger, the primal fear of falling out of the sky, the trader's brain was flooded with BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Right. It's a protein that essentially acts like Miracle-Gro for the brain. It rewires neural pathways and completely recalibrates the brain's threat assessment center.
So suddenly, losing $1 million on a spreadsheet doesn't trigger a panic attack because his brain knows what real mortal danger feels like. Riker asserts that for the male brain, absolute safety is slow cyanide. Facing physical danger is what makes a man dangerous, and therefore calm, collected, and effective in the boardroom.
Okay, so if you are going to live this highly kinetic, high-friction life, how do you fuel it? Section 5 dives into the testosterone economy: diet, sleep, and kinetic intelligence. Riker unpacks what he calls the Spartan diet, and he declares absolute scorched earth war on seed oils.
If there's one thing you take away from this dietary section, it's his hatred for Crisco. He traces the modern dietary collapse back to the invention of Crisco in 1911. Crisco was originally crystallized cottonseed oil industrial waste from the cotton industry that they figured out how to bleach, deodorize, and sell as food.
Riker asserts that modern diets heavy in these highly processed seed oils and soy act as a literal form of chemical castration. The biological claim he makes is that these polyunsaturated fats inflate fat cells, disrupt the endocrine system, and literally aromatize testosterone, converting it into estrogen.
The result, he claims, is a population of men who are physically soft, biologically docile, and politically compliant. Instead of eating from the middle aisles of the grocery store, he advocates for the androgen aisle strategy. This means you only shop the perimeter. You fuel the machine with raw dairy, organ meats like liver, and heavy fatty red meat.
He points to the Maasai warriors in Kenya to validate this. These are men who live almost exclusively on meat, bovine blood, and raw milk. By modern dietary guidelines, their hearts should explode by age 30. Yet Riker notes they boast incredibly high testosterone levels, massive physical endurance, and paradoxically low cholesterol, completely challenging the American Heart Association's narrative on saturated fats.
And it's not just what you put in your body, it's how you recover. Riker elevates sleep from a biological necessity to a tactical imperative. He calls it sleep supremacy.
But he's very specific about the mechanics of it. He breaks down the absolute necessity of hitting 90-minute REM sleep cycles and issues a harsh warning about blue light from screens. The book claims that looking at a smartphone before bed suppresses melatonin production by a staggering 65%.
You aren't just losing sleep. You are chemically preventing your brain from repairing itself.
He even suggests a protocol that sounds like torture to me, but he swears by it. He suggests adopting a 4-hour sleep window at night, just core, deep sleep supplemented by highly strategic, ruthless 20-minute naps during the day.
He compares this brutal, hyper-efficient rest protocol to the habits of former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink. The mindset is that sleep isn't a luxury or a time to dream. It's a weapon you use to repair the muscle and conquer your waking hours.
And what you do with those waking hours matters immensely to your brain. Riker introduces an incredible concept called kinetic intelligence. If you're sitting at a desk right now listening to this, Riker's argument is that your brain is basically starving for tactile input.
He cites research showing that rural, blue-collar manual laborers significantly outscored Ivy League PhDs in spatial reasoning and complex problem-solving tests. The premise here is that the human male brain evolved to solve complex life-or-death problems through physical movement and tactile manipulation of the environment, not through abstract, sedentary thought in a chair.
He calls it the library of muscle. He strongly suggests to the reader that they must learn a hard, physical trade like welding, carpentry, or engine repair. He argues that swinging a hammer or laying a perfect bead of weld fires up the exact same high-level neural networks as jazz improvisation or advanced mathematics.
It's about realizing that the brain is built to act on the physical world, not to plead or debate in a digital one. This insistence on tangible physical control bleeds directly into Section 6, financial sovereignty and the provider gene. For Riker, money isn't just currency to buy nice things, it is biological armor against an institutional world that wants to control you.
He introduces the debt-free doctrine, and he starts it with something called a 72-hour financial fast.
What does that entail?
For 72 hours, a man spends absolutely nothing, $0. You eat whatever's in the pantry, you don't buy gas unless it's to get to work, you don't buy a coffee. It's a psychological reset to break the consumer dopamine loop.
Riker views consumer debt as a form of psychological warfare waged by banking institutions against individuals to keep them compliant. He is incredibly critical of the modern credit system. He literally calls FICO scores loyalty oaths to banks.
He advocates for a scorched earth method to aggressively, violently pay off all debt. He treats financial independence not as a comfortable retirement goal so you can play golf at 65, but as an immediate weapon. The logic is, if you have zero debt and a vault of resources, you are never forced to comply with corporate or social demands you fundamentally disagree with. You can always say no and walk away.
And speaking of walking away, this leads to perhaps the most controversial chapter of the entire book. He details the three-book system and what he calls the provider gene. The evolutionary claim made here is that the female brain is biologically wired to respond to undisclosed, male-controlled provisioning.
Riker claims that when a man privately controls the massive resources of a family without burdening his partner with the details, it significantly lowers her cortisol, her stress hormone. He calls this activating the provider response.
So he is explicitly arguing against the modern advice of total financial transparency in marriage.
100%. The anecdote he uses to illustrate this is wild. He talks about a Houston oil man named Charles Whitaker. Whitaker's wife apparently went on a $97,000 Gucci shopping spree, blowing out a joint account.
Now, modern advice would say they need to go to financial counseling, sit down, and demand transparent equality and shared budgets. But Whitaker didn't do that. Instead, he unilaterally implemented the three-book system.
How does that system work?
He created a hidden offshore vault for his main wealth that she couldn't see, a joint operational account for household expenses that he monitored strictly, and a personal allowance account for her.
And according to Riker's interpretation of the psychological data, men who compartmentalize their finances this way, completely rejecting the modern ideal of total financial transparency, experience higher testosterone levels and a greater sense of authority.
Simultaneously, their wives experience lower baseline stress and anxiety, leading to much higher marital stability. The text explicitly argues that transparent equality in finances is a modern trap that emasculates men, burdens women with the anxiety of the hunt, and ultimately destroys the polarity of the relationship.
So, if you're keeping your finances completely analog and secretive, what does this all mean for engaging with the broader culture? That brings us to our final section, Section 7, Information Warfare, Legacy, and the Culture War.
Riker advises his readers to engage in what he calls tactical deception. He breaks down a concept known as the polygraph principle. He outlines the three-layer lie and the burnable truth effect. This is the intelligence agency tactic of admitting to a minor, embarrassing fault to seamlessly cover up a much larger strategic maneuver.
But what's crucial here for the listener who lives entirely on their phone is his absolute insistence on analog security. Riker explicitly advises men to take their sensitive information entirely off digital platforms. If you have a sensitive conversation, write a handwritten letter. Keep your financial ledgers on paper in a fireproof safe.
His rationale is chilling. Pixels leave permanent, searchable, context-free ghosts. Institutions can and will weaponize your digital history against you at any time. But ink carries plausible deniability. It can be burned.
This raises an important question. If you are keeping your own life analog and hidden, how do you actually shift public consciousness in a digital age? How do you fight the culture war? Riker's answer is meme warfare.
He dismisses logical debate, long-form essays, and policy papers entirely. He says nobody reads them and nobody changes their mind because of a statistic. Instead, he discusses the use of figures like Pepe the Frog and highly coordinated anonymous meme armies.
The book cites data claiming that viral, emotionally charged memes can shift the views of undecided voters 47% faster than a peer-reviewed policy paper. Riker actually compares modern, aggressive meme warfare to Thomas Paine's common sense pamphlets during the American Revolution. He views memes as a blunt, primal instrument that completely bypasses the prefrontal cortex and rationale, igniting tribal instincts directly.
But Riker doesn't want men to just post memes in their basements and fade away into digital obscurity. He closes the book with what he calls the legacy blueprint. He analyzes the Rothschild dynasty. He notes how they centralized control and codified strict, unbreakable family constitutions to maintain their staggering wealth and influence across centuries and empires.
He tells men to stop worrying about their LinkedIn resumes or their digital clout. He wants them focused entirely on the gravestone metric, achievements and empires tangible enough and permanent enough to be literally carved in stone.
And that requires massive local control. Riker advocates for something he calls Saturday skill swaps. This is where grandfathers and fathers completely bypass the digital indoctrination of iPads and public school screens. Instead, they spend Saturdays teaching their grandsons practical analog skills face-to-face. How to butcher a deer, how to fix an alternator, how to read a physical topographical map.
He details grassroots movements like the Ohio Minutemen to show how this works in practice. He outlines a pyramid of local control, instructing men to stop worrying about national elections and instead secure their physical neighborhoods, buy up local hardware stores, and relentlessly take over local school boards to protect their lineage from institutional capture.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought derived directly from Riker's source material. We live in an era that is entirely obsessed with digital permanence, digital arguments, and cultivating digital identities.
But Riker's manual suggests that the ultimate power move, the truest act of rebellion against the modern world, might actually be completely analog. It's about building physical calluses on your hands, keeping paper ledgers locked in a safe, and mentoring a grandson face-to-face without a glowing screen in sight.
It forces you to pause and consider a very stark question. What happens to a society if the men who are supposedly wired to be its builders simply forget how to hold a hammer?
It is a heavy question and an incredibly intense, unapologetic book.
I want to briefly remind you, the listener, as we wrap up, that this deep dive was an impartial exploration of the highly polarizing ideas presented in Riker's text. Our goal was to inform you, to decode the biological and historical arguments presented to this specific audience, and to lay them out clearly. It is not an endorsement of the material.
We hope this breakdown gave you a very clear, nuanced understanding of the mechanics and philosophy driving this particular worldview, so you can evaluate its claims on your own terms.
If you want to read the source material for yourself, dive into his citations, make your own judgments. You must go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Strength Over Silence: Why Men Must Lead, Not Plead.
And you can find more ongoing essays from the author by following @ConradStryker on Substack.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Please take one last moment to like this audio track or video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these custom-tailored, exhaustive breakdowns. See you next time.